Ken Shamrock is known today as a pioneer of mixed martial arts and a pro wrestler during the early stages of WWE's peak Attitude Era. He's a UFC Hall of Famer and a certified ass kicker. But before he became a legend, he was a young upstart in the pro wrestling scene in the late 1980s, wrestling under the name Vince Torelli. It's a much cornier name than Ken Shamrock, isn't it? He's tough as nails and there's no disputing that. But he was involved in an incident on the road that not only took an entire year out of his career, it nearly killed him. So let's get into this first of hopefully many editions of Stories from the Road.
Stand back, there's a new wrestling quiz coming through. Check out BrainBuster, the daily quiz that tests your WWE knowledge with winning streaks, stats, and more. It's time to see if you're up for the challenge.
Ken Shamrock had a bit of a troubled childhood in the 1960s and 70s. His childhood saw him run away from home before getting kicked out and eventually finding a spot in Shamrock's boys' home in California. A fun little side note, the name Shamrock is a tribute to a man named Bob Shamrock who would eventually adopt him. Organized sports saved his life, particularly football and amateur wrestling. Pro wrestling turned out to be his path of choice, and it led him to a place called North Atlantic Pro Wrestling, a promotion that quickly shut shop. Ken Shamrock moved to South Atlantic Pro Wrestling and adopted the ring name Vince Torelli. His colleagues and friends called him Vinny. This, ladies and gentlemen, is where the story begins. October 1989. 25-year-old Ken Shamrock wasn't even a full year into his run with the South Atlantic Pro Wrestling promotion, and the ugly realities of professional wrestling at the time manifested itself into a nasty outcome. When we say nasty, it was quite literally that. The perpetrators of the story were the Nasty Boys, a name that some of our younger audiences might not know of. The Nasty Boys were a pretty big tag team in the 1980s and 90s, but not quite to the level of the Legion of Doom, Demolition, the Hearts, the Rockers, and others of the time. Still, they found success in their careers, becoming WWF World Tag Team Champions and 3-time WCW Tag Team Champions. They were also a part of the South Atlantic Pro Wrestling promotion at the same time as Ken Shamrock, and they were champions there too. In October 1989, the Nasty Boys were finishing up their obligations with SAPW and set to move on to the big stage of WWF. After one of their final shows, the Nasty Boys and other wrestlers like Ken Shamrock went to one of the bars that they actually allowed the wrestlers. When we say one of the bars, it was because wrestlers were known to have quite a bit to drink back in the day and cause trouble wherever they were. Ken Shamrock was sitting in a bar with his friend, a ring crew member, and the man's girlfriend. Brian Knobbs and Jerry Sags of the Nasty Boys also happened to be sitting there. A bit of a trigger warning because the story involves SA and violence. So if you don't want to hear about it, you should probably hit that pause button right now. Brian Knobbs allegedly made comments towards the ring crew member's girlfriend and went on to inappropriately grab a part of her body, and the crew member, being in the position he was, didn't want things to escalate. He could only really say, quote, "Come on, man," while his girlfriend made it clear that she wasn't okay with being touched. Shamrock stood up for her, but it wasn't enough for the Nasty Boys to stop. The two of them were like cowardly dogs who would only bark and act brave when they were around dogs of their own pack. Similarly, the Nasty Boys weren't afraid to get confrontational when they were together. Shamrock had enough and made it clear the next time his friend's girlfriend was touched, he was going to break Knobbs' hand. Knob was a bit of a barroom fighter, and although younger than Shamrock by 2 months, decided he wanted to test him. What Shamrock didn't realize before things could escalate badly was that the bartender was watching and already signaled for the Nasty Boys to be thrown out of the bar. Still, Shamrock had already thrown his drink at Knobbs, and one of the bar bouncers pulled him into the bathroom and tried to calm him down by telling him that the Nasty Boys had already been kicked out. But it wasn't enough for Shamrock to let it go. Since all the talent in South Atlantic Pro Wrestling were staying in the same motel that night, Shamrock knew where he needed to go. So half an hour after the Nasty Boys had gotten kicked out of the bar, Shamrock put on an act pretending like he had cooled down and he was simply heading out. But he was going back to the motel and was banging on every door in the early hours of the morning until he could find the Nasty Boys. Then he reached the door of the legend, Colonel Robert Parker, a man who was also one of the bookers for SAPW at the time. Screaming at the Colonel's face and asking where the Nasty Boys were staying, Parker had no choice but to point him in the direction of their room which was the 3rd floor of their motel. Shamrock wasn't exactly subtle in his quest to find the Nasty Boys, so by the time he kicked their door down, they were waiting for him, or at least only Jerry Saggs was. Brian Knobs, the man responsible for the SA on the woman in the bar, was lying flat on the bed unconscious. After shoving Saggs over the TV set, Shamrock went for Knobs, who got a black eye because of his attack, but Saggs would take a metal telephone and smack Shamrock behind his head, knocking him out cold. Calling it a bad shot would be a massive understatement. Turns out, the Nasty Boys hatched a plan where Knobs was playing possum and pretending to be unconscious. Shamrock doesn't remember anything that happened after the phone was smacked behind his head, but it was bad. Like a head swelling up like a balloon kind of bad. Ken Shamrock later revealed that they broke his sternum and eye socket and put him in a concussion. He first said, quote, "They almost killed me," end quote, and clarified that he technically died in the ambulance going to the hospital, but was brought back to life. It took him almost a whole year to recover from that. The condition he was in was so gruesome that SAPW booker Frank Dusek revealed that Shamrock hardly looked human because of how brutal the attack was. The Nasty Boys both denied using a phone and claimed that they only used their hands and feet. The legendary Colonel Robert Parker, who we mentioned earlier, knew what was happening and had to intervene and call other wrestlers to stop it from escalating further. They had to talk the Nasty Boys out of literally killing Ken Shamrock. Pitbull Gary Wolf, who was also a talent near the scene, said the 5'2" security guard pleaded with him and others to stop the fight because he couldn't do it himself. By the time they arrived, they saw Knobs was out cold while Brian Saggs was blasting Ken Shamrock with the telephone. He dragged Shamrock to the door and screamed that he was going to throw him over the guardrail that was 3 stories up. The people around had to go in and physically tackle Saggs to prevent Shamrock from what was going to be a certain death. Gary Wolf said that it doesn't matter if you're the most dangerous man in the world because if you're drunk, you can't fight. Shamrock was unfortunately very drunk that night. Colonel Robert Parker pretty much confirmed that the story was true, except with a few additional details. It was the woman who was SA'd by Knobs who came to Parker's door to plead for help before Shamrock was screaming in his face. Parker said he had never seen somebody's head as big as Shamrock's did when he was attacked. He genuinely thought that Shamrock was going to die and told Saggs to call 911 to help. He had to be the voice of reason to actually. What he also revealed was that the Nasty Boys previously had to leave a different territory due to an unspecified problem of a similar nature, which is what brought them to South Atlantic Pro Wrestling. To protect the Nasty Boys' careers, Parker and the other talent around got together and told the same story. Shamrock was ready to beat Knobs down and Saggs had to defend him. That way, neither of them got arrested, and in doing so, Parker protected the Nasty Boys' career. In reality, as you'll soon find out, he only helped extend it. The trouble they would bring didn't vanish overnight. The Nasty Boys and Shamrock went their separate ways, but for a while, other SAPW talent made sure to sit far away from him because of the reputation he developed as a hothead. We can only hope that Colonel Robert Parker had good intentions when protecting the Nasty Boys, because you could very much argue that they didn't deserve to be protected. But it's an important reminder that this is only one of the known stories back in the day. We can't imagine the stuff that happened that was never told. Holding that much anger in your head isn't a good idea anyway, but to do so for 8 years, you'd think that Ken Shamrock would explode if he ever saw them again. 1998. The Nasty Boys were gone from WWE for quite a while due to backstage behavior, while Ken Shamrock had been signed to WWE for a year at that point. Recalling what happened to Hannibal TV, what followed was nothing short of incredible. Ken Shamrock was in the airport alongside Billy Gunn waiting in line to clock in. Guess who Shamrock spotted in line? Brian freaking Knobs. In a fit of rage, Ken Shamrock turned into a pressure cooker that was about to explode. He dropped his bags and his face turned red. Recognizing Shamrock, who was now much bigger and buffer than he last saw 8 years ago, Knobs quickly exited the vicinity. When Shamrock saw Jerry Saggs, he was about to go after him until Billy Gunn held him back and pleaded by saying, "Not here. Not here." Jerry Saggs unsurprisingly left at the same pace that Brian Knobs did. Billy Gunn, who had never seen a human being get so intense in his life, tried his best to calm him down. Other accounts have stated that Owen Hart and Stone Cold Steve Austin tried provoking the situation, but there's nothing official to confirm that it's true. When they were walking up to the gate, Ken heard a voice saying, quote, "Hey man, what's wrong with Shamrock, man? Somebody needs to give him a chill pill," end quote. When Shamrock turned around, he saw Jerry Sags. Like a man possessed, he went straight to him and even jumped over the seats and spun Sags around, and he said he was going to kill him. Sags had a big bag in his hand and bent it in a way that implied that he was going to swing it at Shamrock. He dropped his bag and Shamrock told him to go ahead and that he would give him the first punch, something he always said he would do if he ever came face to face with Sags again. Sags' reply was so bizarre that nearly a decade of pin-up anger and aggression just left Ken Shamrock's body. Jerry Sags told him, quote, "If you hit me, that's a federal offense," end quote. We can't even imagine what it must have been like to be Ken Shamrock at that moment. Every feeling of anger and ill will just went up in smoke. But according to the man himself, he thought, quote, "That's it? After the entire tough persona the Nasty Boys put on, that's all he was going to say?" End quote. According to Shamrock, it was a blessing that he never got revenge by physically attacking Knobbs and Sags. All the boys in the WWE locker room were present right then and there to witness what happened. So in a big way, Shamrock got his revenge without lifting a finger. Everybody saw how Jerry Sags became a coward despite talking trash about Shamrock for 8 years since the incident. Indeed, it was pretty much over for the Nasty Boys. They'd still continue wrestling, but their years in the big time were over and done with. In the long run, Ken Shamrock became a much more influential and well-remembered name. For all we know, this could have just been another normal day for wrestlers on the road in the 1980s and 90s. Do you remember much about the Nasty Boys? Let us know what you think of this story in the comments below. As always, thanks for watching.